Board of Trustees meeting to order. Special counsel, please call the roll.
Just want to make sure, are we live?
We are.
Okay, thank you. Clerk Cantrell? Councilmember King? Director Barnes? Here. Director Duplessis?
Present.
Director Kennedy?
Present.
Director Guzman? Here. Director Pacho?
Here.
Director Swass? Director Howard?
Here.
Director Scholas? Director Antrup?
Here.
Ms. Johnsey?
Here.
Mr. Davis?
Here.
Mr. McGould? Ms. Shawn? Here. We have a quorum.
Thank you. May we have a motion to approve the minutes of the December 20th, 2023 Board of Trustees meeting?
So moved.
Second, do we have a second?
Second.
Been moved in second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Want to proceed to the presentation item this morning with Mitchell Vilby from Rod and Wisdom. But I just want to make one opening comment. Today's session is for educational purposes as we invited our plan actuary to lead a discussion on various pension matters that typically generate questions from members. Based on questions received over the past several months, we've asked Mitchell again to facilitate a listening session, which hopefully will be open and accessible to all, on governance, rule changes, plan funding, best practices, actuarial services, including the experience study and reciprocity agreement with CNO. Really a host of possible topics which we've touched on at various points during the regular meetings, but within the session today, we look forward to questions and answers on those areas which are top of each person's mind to increase the overall awareness of plan operations so we can be better informed. We've also included some educational materials developed by Rudd and Wisdom that you can review in depth at any time. And if I'm correct, you will be returning again in July for the annual evaluation report and presentation. Also in October, we're planning to receive your 5-year experience study covering 2018-2023 with recommendations on plan assumptions.
Yes, sir.
So with that having been said, I'll ask you to proceed with today's presentation.
Okay, thank you. So today's purpose is a training session, and have a sort of just to show it's a long handout that can be referenced for training purposes outside of this meeting today, as there are some obligatory training standards for you all to do a certain number of hours a year, and thought we would kind of cover a number of those through a case study. And is that the remote for the slides? We may jump around a little bit, and this is meant to be a conversation, so please jump in as we go with questions, or I'll be asking some questions as we go through this. But first, just quickly, the pension committee, is comprised of a number of members, and in the rules and regulations in section 3.1, it outlines some of the duties of the committee, including administering the plan in accordance with the rules and regulations, acting solely in the interest of the plan's members and beneficiaries, and then interpreting the rules and regulations when they are not clearly spelled out. And there are a number of other responsibilities, including things that we'll do later in the year, reviewing the valuation report, and we'll talk about the experience study as well. For the Board of Trustees, it's comprised of the Board of Directors plus the employee and retiring members of the pension committee, and Article 3 also outlines the rules and responsibilities of the Board of Trustees and their training requirements. And you'll see there in about the middle of the slide, there's 5 hours a year of educational requirements, and is broken into various investment hours, actuarial rules and regulations, and fiduciary duty and ethics. And so we'll be covering some of those requirements today, and as we said, this slide presentation, there's plenty of other slides you can look at with respect to getting some of that other training time in. So that's the background. And in terms of today, sort of the discussion, a couple years ago, received a letter inquiring about potentially changing the plan formula from one of the employee members of the pension committee. And so we thought we might go through that as a case study to help us kind of go over some of the items and responsibilities of the trustees. And I just want to kind of, let's see, in this one pager, which I can put on the screen, but it's pretty hard to read. In terms of the rules and responsibilities, outside of the ones I mentioned, also in this slide, there's lots of information on the GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, with respect to best practices. And there are a number of those best practices that are covered in more detail in these slides that talk about the regular studies that actuaries prepare and that the board must review and things to look for in those studies. The design of the overall design of the plan and what are the workforce goals for recruitment and retention, and are you meeting those goals? The financial effects of the plan on the Sewage and Water Board, and things like that. And then, of course, the responsibilities of, you know, what would you do if we were to pursue a study? And again, to be clear, nobody, the pension committee itself, the Board of Trustees, has not requested a formal study, but this is in the context of a member's request that it be evaluated. And so we have some general information about that and things to consider if you were to pursue a full study of the plan itself. And some of those items would be, you know, as I mentioned, you need to act in the best interest of all plan members, not just employees, but employees and retirees. And, you know, if you were to enhance the benefits, as this case study will talk about, how would that affect the funding of the plan, and is that improving the benefit security for all members? And lastly, not only does the plan talk about, as I mentioned, one of these slides, no, I can't remember where it is, but acting solely in the interest of the members and beneficiaries, the GFOA governance guidance states that trustees must not be motivated by personal views or interest and should act in the interest of all plan members. So it's not just in the plan itself, it's also a best practice. So with that said, let's go way ahead in this presentation to the plan amendment that was put on the table as something to consider. So back in 2022, employee member of the pension committee requested 3 plan design changes be analyzed. The first would be changing the vesting schedule from a 5-year vesting period to a 10-year vesting period. The second would be increasing the formula or the benefit accrual factors. The middle column there shows what the current formula is, which is 2.5% of final average pay for the first 25 years of service, and over 25 years it changes to 4% of pay for each additional year. And the proposal would be to change that 2.5% factor to a 3% factor, which is a 20% increase in that factor. In both cases, though, in no event would the formula yield more than 100% of final average pay. So that's in the plan right now, and that would need to stay in the plan. And the third proposed change was about decreasing the maximum plan benefit. The current maximum benefit is restricted by the IRS to either $275,000 per year as an annuity, or if less, the final 3-year average of pay. And the proposal was to reduce it from that limit to $130,000 a year. And we'll talk more about that. Furthermore, the design changes were requested to be implemented retroactively. So, you know, first, you know, the question would be what's prompted a desire to, you know, consider exploring a change to the plan. And I believe you had put forth this letter, so
Yes,
I wanted
sir.
to just ask you directly what prompted that.
Because surrounding cities, in all of this, like the 10-year investment period was there from the inception of Sewage and Water Board benefit plan till 2020, when a politician came in and he was trying to privatize the Sewage and Water Board, and the employees fought tooth and nail. And finally, he said, okay, the privatization was defeated. So he tweaked and got the 10 years to 5 years to benefit his appointed non, classified employees. So we want to go back because some of these unclassified political appointees get way more salaries than the civilian employees doing the same work, which again is another debate, another day, that as per the civil service rule, if two people are doing the same job, they're supposed to get the same money. So that was the reason it was put in, that we should go back to 10 years, at least protect our pension fund from the unclassified, higher paid employees. I'm gonna give you an example. If somebody is making, let's say, $250,000 annual salary as an unclassified employee, and a person who has worked 35, 34 years, our average employee take home benefit is $24,000 to $28,000. You do the math. If somebody comes in for 4 years or 8 years, he may be walking away with $50,000 pension. So it is unfair for the people who have worked 34 years to walk away with only 28,000, earning each and every single penny, whereas this political appointee may be brought in at a higher rate. He may be contributing higher, but on the other hand, he's taking a big bite of our pension funds.
Few
And to add furthermore, our surroundings, Jefferson Parish, city of Baton Rouge, city of Shreveport, all of them have similar statutes. Like Jefferson Parish, minimum is 7 years. Baton Rouge is 10 years. Shreveport is 10 years.
Can I ask a question? The entities that we have a reciprocity agreement with, because to keep those agreements intact, have we looked at those surrounding areas for their vestment period? Because just to counter a bit what you're saying, our job market right now in reality is very competitive. We've all felt it in the changes in the way that we work and function pretty much since that time, since COVID. And when you look at the reality of attracting talent, the fact that we have a 5-year vest period, whether you're classified or unclassified, it's the same requirement, is very attractive for a lot of people when pensions throughout the nation are going away.
So what you are saying, the Jefferson Parish, city of Baton Rouge, and city of Shreveport are wrong?
I'm not saying
No,
anything
because
of the
for-
sort, so please don't put anything in my mouth. I'm saying exactly what I'm saying is, have we looked at the other entities where we have a reciprocity agreement with right now? Because we have quite a high flow of people between all of these different entities. And if we stop that as a potential recruitment tool for us to get this talent in similar work fashion, that's a very, very big risk that we should be looking at.
On the other hand, thanks to my intervention directly with the mayor, our technical staff salaries are very compatible to the current market offering. So we are, we want to make sure, and retention for the last at least 8-10 years in the technical side has been very high, very less turnover. So if we are giving them apple to apple from the market to the public sector, I don't see where it is this will discourage for anybody from joining. And for almost 90 some years, we had that. It was tweaked because to benefit Mark Morial.
Let's have Mitchell respond. You asked for the status of why the request was made. I'd like to hear your response.
So, a couple things. With respect to the reciprocity agreements, there's one specifically, it's built into the rules and regulations solely with respect to the city of New Orleans and the NOMERS, or New Orleans Municipal Employees Retirement System. The formulas there are the same 2.5% for 25 years and 4% above that, with one exception. The city changed the formula for employees hired after, I think, 2018, and they only get the 2.5% factor, so they don't get the 4% anymore. Sewage and Water Board hasn't done that.
I thought they reversed that, did they not?
Well, so, okay, I'm not an expert in that plan, but at one point I thought they had reduced it to 1.9%, and they reversed that and brought it back to 2.5%. But I was looking at their most recent valuation report, which I think was their 2023, and the plan provisions listed in that valuation talked about a no 4% factor for people hired after either 2017 or 2018. Yes.
I am a little confused because this doesn't seem to be what's on the agenda for today. Discussion of a plan amendment. I would think if there were such a thing coming up for discussion, we would have gotten material in advance. And I think it's a very complicated question. I mean, I think you start asking these questions, you actually get to the questions of whether, whether there should be some kind of hybrid plan, et cetera. And I think I would prefer sticking with the roles, responsibilities, best practices, and other matters of general plan education rather than launching into a specific plan amendment discussion.
Well, I'm okay to do whatever.
Yeah.
Originally, it was a training session, then it was asked that if we could talk about this sort of as a way to guide us through some of those issues with the roles and responsibilities, but I'm amenable, so whatever you all would like.
The idea was, because of the questions that had been raised by pension committee member or members, we would at least present that, but the idea is to focus on the educational session and for you to talk about the specific rules and regulations and the guidance piece that we have to adhere to.
Okay. So would you like me to kind of come off of the plan amendment discussion and just go back through the slides in general to discuss the broader education? Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that works just fine. If we maybe just come back to the agenda in this presentation. So roles and responsibilities, we discussed that. I'll briefly go over what my firm, Rudd & Wisdom, as the actuaries for the plan does. And then we'll talk about GFOA guidelines and best practices. And then maybe we'll have time to touch on reciprocity agreement in more detail. Actual experience studies, things coming up at the next couple meetings I'll be attending in July and October. So we talked about the committee and the Board of Trustees responsibilities. What my firm does is we prepare the annual actuarial evaluations where we're determining for the pension plan the annual employer funding contribution, what level should be contributed each year based on the plan's funded status. And we also determine the accounting valuations for purposes of complying with the GASB requirements for information about the pension plan and the OPEB plan, or the which is other post-employment benefit plan, or the health benefits provided under the employee benefit plan for retirees, and how those liabilities hit the employer's books, both on the balance sheet and the income statement. So we prepare that information. We also calculate the annual insurance reserves for the employee benefit plan for both the active and retiree components of that plan. We recently sent that information, I think, last week. When members, you have an employee from the city come to work here, or vice versa, someone from here goes to work for the city, there's a reciprocity agreement in place that says, okay, this employee is considered a transfer for purposes of the two pension plans, and the employee gets their service transferred. So because the formulas are the same, they get to go from here to the city and have the same level of benefit, using their past service from here. And as part of that transfer, the pension fund transfers assets commensurate with that level of benefits being transferred. And the reciprocity agreement lays out how that asset amount is calculated and transferred.
How often does this happen?
That happens a dozen times a year. Yeah, about once a month we get a request, give or take.
And what is the vesting period for the city?
I believe it's also 5 years, but that I'd need to confirm.
Yes, it is. I just
Okay.
wanted to
Yeah.
let everybody know.
Okay.
And what does the transfer look like when it is not the city, but a different pension plan, the state, federal?
Yeah, so when there's other transfers, right, for example, a state plan, lasers, or, you know, another plan, what the employee has the option of transferring their service. They don't have to. So they can leave their if they're vested, they can leave their benefit here in this plan and go start like a new employee for the state plan, for example. But if they choose to transfer, there is a separate set of statutes that governs how that transfer calculation is determined for purposes of transferring assets. And sometimes, if, let's say, the formula is richer at the state level, which, you know, it can be, or it could be richer here, depending on which plan. You know, not all plans are the same. Then let's say that the assets being transferred are not sufficient to purchase that level of service at the state plan. Then the employee has the option of coming up with the difference themselves to transfer the full service. If not, a pro rata amount of service is transferred. So, you know, again, in NOMERS, plans are identical, money going back and forth, transfers all service, and it's got its own special calculation. But for other transfers, we go through and do a special calculation and determine, can all the service transfer? If not, should the employee has the option of putting up the additional funds to transfer the full amount. So, and that happens, again, probably not as many times as city transfers, half a dozen times a year, give or take. But you know, we certainly assist with those. Other things we do, we assist from time to time with calculations for individuals who are actually retiring, or if a death benefit's going to be paid, we'll work with the benefits department to calculate optional forms of payment, joint survivor forms, things like that, and review calculations as requested. We also prepare the annual employee benefit statements, which gives the employees a snapshot of, hey, your benefit as of January 1 is X dollars per year payable at 65, and we project your benefit to grow this much between now and then if you work a full career here. So it gives folks at least once a year a look into their retirement benefits. As Mr. Pacho mentioned, we'll also perform an actual experience study. We do that. We've been doing it every 5 years, and in one of these slides, GFOA now recommends these be performed every 3 years. But that's where we look at the actual experience of the employees, the plan. What did their pay raises look like over that 5-year period? What were the incidents of terminations, at what ages, at what level of service? Did people retire as we assumed they would retire? We compare that, the actual experience, to the assumptions we're using, and we use that as a guide for should we tweak the assumptions to better model the liabilities of the plan. So we'll talk more about that in October.
When was the last time
We did that it was an experience study with information, I think, through the end of 2018. So the 5 years ending 2018, and we presented it in 2019 or early 2020. This time we'll be doing the 5 years ending December of 2023, and we'll present it later this year. And if there are any recommended assumption changes and the board decides to make those changes, they would be effective beginning next year, in the next year evaluation for 2025.
So from the 2018 experience study, what changes were recommended?
We recommended a number of changes in that experience study. We recommended mortality changes for projecting people's expected lifetimes, changes to the expected payroll growth, changes to rates of termination, rates of retirement, and rates of disability. We did hold steady on some assumptions, including the expected return of the assets at 7%. So we'll look at all that again, but we were taking over from another actuary at the last experience study, and a number of the assumptions were, I'd say, oversimplified. And so I think unless experience dictates major changes, we wouldn't expect major changes this go round. I would say we had some major changes last go round, but we'll see what the experience tells us, and that's why we do it every 5 years.
What's the current contribution percentage for the employee versus the board?
The employee is 6%, and the board is 21%. So
How
that's
much
that.
of that is past, is the accrued liability versus current?
The current, I don't have that information in front of me, but I believe the current accruals are around 11 or 12% a year. So the employee is funding about half of their accruals, and the rest of the funding is to fund up, from the employer side, is funding up past liabilities that are unfunded.
But you just said 12%, 11 to 12% was current for the employer?
What I mean is the 12, maybe I misunderstood your question. There's what's called the normal cost, which is the accrual rate of the employees.
Yes.
And that's, I think, around 12%. I may have it in one of the slides, but my recollection is around 12% of pay, which means the employees are funding about half the benefit.
You're only paying 6%, that's a third.
Well,
Of the
6
12.
is half of 12.
But the board is putting in, you said the board is putting in 12?
Okay. No, the actual liability accrual is 12%. The board is putting in 21, so about 6% of the board's 21 is funding current accruals,
Okay,
and
thank you.
15% is funding past benefits that are unfunded.
So as far as unfunded liability from the board, what is the percentage which, or they have caught up with?
So the plan is about 71% funded. And so the additional funding above the current level of accruals is being used to fund up that unfunded liability. And it's being done over an amortization period that varies. It's probably on average around 25 years though. So it's,
No, my question is that if we are contributing 6% and the board is supposed to be 21%,
yes.
so how far back or we are caught up? I know the employees have no choice, they get that deduction. But as far as the employer contribution, are they caught up with matching 21% to 2023?
Well,
Because in the past, with all due respect, in the past, there was a huge gap between the employee's contribution and the employer contribution, which was lacking a whole lot. So I wanted to ask you if the employer contribution has caught up in the past few years.
The employer contribution has increased substantially in the last few years since we did that experience study. And so I don't remember what it was. It may have been around 18%. I don't have that information in front of me, but we in our annual valuation reports, we show at least a 10-year history of employer and employee contributions. So you can see, and I think that valuation report's on the website, in past presentations. So it has that information. I don't have it at my fingertips.
So as far as you are saying that it's not caught up, the 21% which was supposed to be the employer.
I was just going to add, for the committee, the funding policy was established in 2021, and we've made all the contributions as recommended and required by the funding policy since that went into effect. So we continue to make progress towards increasing the overall funded status at the rates the actuary calculates. So all that's been done.
So there is
Consistent with
no
policy.
lacking in the employer's contribution.
No, the employer's contribution is designed specifically to fund up the plan to 100%. And so that additional 15% or so I was saying of the employer contribution the total employer contribution is helping to fund current accruals of current employees It's funding their portion of that 100%, and it is funding the unfunded liability over a period of time in accordance with the funding policy. So, you know, assets are going to fluctuate year over year. The funding percentage may go up and down, but the funding policy takes that into account each year and recommends an increase or a decrease to the employer's contribution percentage so that the plan is fully funded by the end of the amortization period. And so there is no shortfall in the employer's contribution. You know, it is actuarially sound.
One more question about that, Mitchell. You said that it was recommended to do one every 3 years. Are you gonna do every 3 years? Are you sticking with 5 years?
Well, we'll discuss that. So one of the changes in 2023, one of the best practices that the GFOA published was with respect to experience studies, and they changed it used to be at least every 5 years, and they recommended 3 or 4 for larger pension. And when I say larger, I'm talking about a state level plan, not a plan with 2,000 members. They've changed that to say specifically 3 years. So we'll of course do that if you want to follow the best practice, but that's up to the board as to tell us, and we will just tell you it's what the best practice says.
What is the typical cost of your study?
A typical cost of our study,
In dollar amounts?
yes, in dollar amounts, around $25,000, which is, you know, every 5 years.
Okay, proceed.
Okay, so that's what we do, all of that, and this pension portal, which you'll hear more about later in the year. We finally got the census information to get rolling on that, and it will give employees a chance, instead of getting a benefit statement just once a year, which they'll still get, they'll have an opportunity to go in and do their own estimates. What if I terminate on date X? What if I retire on date X? What will my benefit look like? So it gives folks a way to educate themselves more about their benefits, and this retirement benefit, which is an extremely important part of the overall compensation package provided to employees, right? It's not just the pay you're getting today, it's the pension you're going to get if you work here for your career. And so it's a very good educational tool.
And what's the timeline on that?
We expect to, in the middle of summer, we expect to be rolling out, at least to the benefits department and anybody else designated to test the system, an opportunity to test it, and then we'll have discussions about how we're going to roll it out and the exact timing of that after it's been tested.
So you foresee it by end of this year, we may have that?
I do.
Thank
I
you,
do.
sir.
Yes.
But the pension statements that we give out annually, those are gonna be provided
Yes,
for the portal.
that's correct. That's
Okay,
correct.
I just wanted to make sure we're still on track with the regular annual pension statements.
We are.
But moving forward, we'll also have the portal running.
When, Stephanie, when they're expected?
The statements,
Mm-hmm.
we usually send them out in June. We're going to see if we can do it in May this year. And
We're trying to be a little bit more aggressive this year. Every year we do it a little sooner. Thank you.
And those are something that we just started providing in the last 3 or 4 years. So those didn't used to be provided. So in terms of the GFOA best practices, there's a number, just as brief background, GFOA has over 23,000 members of finance officers in the US and Canada. And its role is as a resource educator, facilitator for its members. They publish best practices, which they update periodically, and there were some ones related to pension plans updated in 23, and we'll talk about those. And they just identify policies and procedures that are designed to improve both management as well as reporting of financial information. So we'll talk more about the pension and benefit administration categories and some of these others of accounting, auditing, et cetera. But they serve all categories. So in 2023, they updated their guidance on pension plans, both sustainable funding practices as a specific best practice and the core elements of funding policy. We'll talk in more detail about that, but you cover those very well with your funding policy. And then, you know, they recommend employers should fund the annual actuarial determined contribution, which you all do. And again, the target there is to fund the plan 100%. And that's one of the goals they recommend is targeting the plan 100%. Strategies for surplus management, if you become 100%, over 100% funded, which your funding policy does touch upon. Controlling the volatility of the contribution year over year, and we have a number of methods in there to do that. And that the employee contributions be contributed at regular intervals, and you all do that biweekly. So that's all kind of as fast as you can contribute it. Some employers wait till the end of the year to make the contribution. You do it throughout the year, which is definitely a best practice. That the annual valuations should include some gain-loss analysis. That's where we look at how did the results come out relative to what we assumed. And so when you have big gains and losses year over year, you would expect when you do an experience study to make big changes to the assumptions. We're not seeing huge gains and losses, so that's why I think we probably won't have big recommendations when we do the study, but remains to be seen. And again, what I've talked about a couple times, these now say the best practice would be doing the experience study every 3 years. So we can talk about after we finish this study, if you want to schedule the next one for 3 years out. And I just want to say that we're not going to have time to go through all this, and that wasn't the intent, so that you can, you know, just as in terms of furthering your education, meeting the education requirements, that you would have an opportunity to do some of this on your own. And at the very end, I do have a link to the GFOA website where you can specifically look at any of these best practices we talk about if you want to read them in detail. And while that may not be, you know, fun reading, most of these best practices are 2 to 5 pages, double spaced with, you know, it's not heavy lifting, but it's you know, it's not always entertaining. So, to be frank, but in terms of that, and I think I'm not going to get into detail on this, but their best practices on actual determined contributions to reduce volatility. You do all these things in your funding policy. So you are already smoothing assets. You of course have a diverse investment portfolio to help avoid, you know, too much volatility in your assets as best you can, but ultimately the market does what the market does. You have a investment policy that guides that. That's outside the scope of what we do, but that is one of the recommendations they have, and you have that. You have an investment policy statement, and you last updated it, I think, in December of 21 or 22. So that's something you do keep an eye on and update periodically. You know, they recommend designing the plan to avoid calculation abuses such as salary spiking. And so some plans that have overtime as part of the plan compensation, you'll see that salary abuse where, hey, it's a known thing that in your last 3 years of employment, we're going to let those people do all the overtime. Now their average pay goes up 25% and their benefits 25% bigger. And the plan isn't anticipating that, you know, and all of a sudden the liability is much greater and it harms the current retirees and things like that. Yes.
I just wanted to add, that's not a part of our plan.
That's right.
So overtime.
Overtime's
no
not.
worries
Yeah,
about that.
yeah.
Overtime is not a
That's
part
right.
of our pensionable calculation.
That's correct. And so you already have some measures in there, and the retroactive drops, those are also a way to in a way game the system as a member. You know, if you have a health event and you know, oh gosh, I'm not gonna, this lifetime annuity isn't gonna benefit me. Let me do a retro drop and get basically a lump sum, you know, and so there are things, and your plan doesn't have retro drops. So I don't think that's a concern for this plan, but again, in the best practices. The core elements, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. And you'll see sometimes, hey, these best practices for one cover topics in another. So there's some overlap, as you'll see in some of these slides. But the cost method that we use to value the liabilities is the recommended best practice one, this entry age method. It's also the required one for your accounting rules for GASB compliance, so you're good there. These asset smoothing, you do that over a 7-year period. They recommend 5 to 10 years. The amortization of the unfunded liability, they recommend exactly what you're doing, closed periods, fixed periods, a layered approach. We can talk more about that with the valuations in that presentation, but you do all those things and your periods fall within the parameters of what they recommend. Surplus management, when you get to be 100% funded, we can spend more time worrying about what to do with all that excess. But there is something in the funding policy about that, and we might recommend tweaking that a little bit to be in line with this, but that's a good problem to have, and a problem we expect you to have when the plan gets fully funded. This slide, a little hard to read, but it just goes through in the middle column, it's the GFOA guidance for these best practices with respect to the funding policy. The right-hand column is what's in your funding policy, and where some item is red, that's where there's a difference between the best practice and what you have. The first highlighted item you see there, the red item, is when you transition from one funding policy to another, which you did in 2021. You have to decide how you're going to amortize that transition liability. The best practice doesn't even discuss that. So, we did something, and now that period we took a 30-year period and closed it, and now we're down to, I think, 26 years at 1/1/24. So, that's compliant with their other guidelines, even though they don't specifically address this one. Again, some red here. They recommend the funding policy stipulate the contributions we made at intervals. The funding policy doesn't stipulate that, but you do it bi-weekly. We can put that in the funding policy. We can amend it to state that if you want. But again, your practice is doing what they want you to do. It just doesn't state it directly. The risk reduction strategies when the plan is fully funded. Again, that is an asset management issue that's not handled in the funding policy. And while the investment policy statement you have doesn't directly address that, it does require an annual review of the IPS and make changes when it's appropriate. And so certainly if the plan becomes overfunded, your annual review, this would be a discussion topic. So these are some things where you can potentially amend the funding policy, the IPS, to say things directly, but in practice they're going to happen, whether or not you state them directly. And again, the funding policy that we drafted in 21 says do the study every 5 years for the experience study. Now the rules or the recommended best practices have changed to 3. You may want to amend that to say 3 years instead of 5. But again, we can discuss all that when we do the experience study presentation. But
what is the average size of the entities that GFOA have under their 2,000 employees, 2,500 employees? Because we definitely don't have that.
I couldn't tell you what the average size is, but it would, because it covers governmental entities in all 50 states, municipalities, I suspect the average might be smaller than you would guess because, these huge state systems have hundreds of thousands of members, but how many municipalities are there in each state, that have some of them just hundreds, or dozens, or
Yes.
So I couldn't tell you, and I don't know if that information's on their website, but certainly can look.
I tried, but I couldn't get it.
Yeah. The governance guidance for trustees, these are some broad topics, but duty of loyalty. We talked about acting for the exclusive benefit of the members of the plan, the participants and beneficiaries. Duty of care, duty of prudence, acting prudently, not doing anything rash. I think that happens naturally, especially when you have a group. It's not 2 people doing this, it's a giant board. So there's good discussion whenever anybody has an idea about something. I think those things get handled well, but I think everybody acts prudently anyway. They have recommended best practices for governance structure, board size, board composition. Again, I think you cover that and meet those recommendations. You do have term limits for employee and retiree members, and of course, board members change over time as that goes. So again, I think you probably comply with all of these things. You know, clearly outlining the expectations and roles of those involved in decision-making processes. Your rules and regulations do that for the pension committee and the board of trustees. You know, and then in terms of the employees and the benefits department and whatever, you have managers who work with them. And so, you know, to the extent you all feel there's anything that falls short of these recommended best practices, of course, you have the opportunity to recommend changes internally. And then maintaining the governance policies, you know, having a clear mission, vision, code of ethics, board education. Again, a lot of that's stated in the rules and regulations. You have an IPS. They said, you know, they want you to develop and maintain an investment policy statement. You have one, and you do that at least annually, and I think you meet maybe quarterly about how the investments are going. And then the one item I don't know that you have, and I'm looking into this, you know, do you have an actual governance manual? You may not, and if you don't, do you want to develop one that kind of covers a lot of these categories and puts a policy on top of things you're already doing? So that may be something to explore. But we can assist in looking into that. In fact, we're trying to see if we can find anything right now, but I don't know that that's what they're specifically addressing here. I'm not sure how common that is in practice, but again, it's a best practice. We've kind of been over this, and I've just mentioned the governance manual. That's in red because I'm not certain that you have one. The investment policy statement, again, they have a best practice on what should be included in here. You know, and I believe this is something you should look at with your investment policy statement at hand, which we have. Again, we're not investment managers or experts on the asset side of things. I believe you have all of these things in place, or you have procedures by meeting at least annually to evaluate these items. So you certainly have a statement of the goal of the investment policy and of what you want to fully fund the plan. How you're going to manage risk. You have information there about asset allocation, strategy, liquidity, enough liquidity to pay the benefits. You know, that hasn't been an issue. And how you select the investment consultants and how you evaluate their performance and replace them when needed. I've seen some of that in action. I know you all do that. You know, and then cost management. I know that's when you look at how many basis points does this fund charge, and you know, things like that. That's happening. Whether or not it's explicitly stated in the IPS, I'm not certain. But in practice, these things are happening to the best of my knowledge. And then they have some other guidelines about you know, foreign assets, which sometimes the parameters around those are a little harder to spell out because of emerging markets and you know what you know, currency transfers, things like that. But you do have things in your policy to discuss that, and avoiding conflicts of interest, which is sort of common sense, but making sure you have guidelines for service providers, and again, with your evaluation at least once a year of those providers, I think you're probably addressing those if conflicts arise. And so as I've been going through this, when you see things in quotes, those are the actual names of the best practice, the investment policy best practice, the investment fee guidelines best practice, and so on. And so all those things are on the GFOA website. We're not going into too much detail on each of these, but again, you can evaluate if you have those addressed in your IPS or outside of your IPS, and if not, is there anything you can do to better follow these best practices?
Aren't we already doing some of these?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I think you're doing most of these, but again, the purpose of today is to talk about you know, educational requirements, and some of those can be done on your own by going to the website, reading these best practices, and going, are we compliant? And again, I don't believe I'm qualified to state on the investment best practices if you're following those to the T. I think in general you are, but that is stuff where you can evaluate and have discussions with at your investment meetings with your investment manager or consultant about is there anything you need to do different to follow these best practices. The role of the actual evaluation report is another best practice, and I think our evaluation reports cover all the items they want you to cover in there, and we certainly meet once a year to go over the results and discuss them. And so you can read through these, but yes, we produce an actuarially determined contribution that's consistent with the funding policy. We review the funded status of the plan, the ratio of the assets to the liabilities. We spell out all the assumptions and reevaluate them every 5 years. We include historical information so you can see the progress of the funding ratio, of how the employer contributions have changed over time, some of the things we've talked about. And we do talk about risks and uncertainty. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball. We're making a lot of assumptions, but we reevaluate those assumptions periodically when needed. And then how to use a report they talk about. And so you've been doing that in developing the funding policy to mitigate risk. And then the responsibilities of the sponsor, prior to the report's issuance. So we have to collect annual census information from you, employees, their dates of hire, their pay, et cetera. What we do things to, if we have questions, we go, hey, this doesn't look right. Did this person terminate and rehire because their date of hire? We do go through all that. But you also have auditors who audit the information that's being given to us, and practices in place to ensure the data we get is good. Obviously, if we're using data that has problems, your valuation is going to be deficient. So there's practices in place, not only internally here, in working with you as the actuary to ask questions when we have them, but also separately your auditor is looking at this information. And then, of course, the other responsibilities of folks at SWB&O are to let us know if there's any changes that have been made to practices, plan provisions, et cetera. So we do that. We get current copies of the rules and regulations and things like that. How are we doing on time? Because there's a number of things. I'll just kind of keep going, but okay. I'll wrap it up. But so you can go through these slides, but they're all, sort of each slide here talks about different best practices. Here's one about design. What are the goals for income replacement with the pension plan, et cetera. So this kind of ties back to the benefit formula, investing, and all that stuff. So they have a best practice on that. And with the portal and the employee education, you may develop more questions about this, as people get more educated about their benefits. So, but there's some guidance here on things to consider. The participant communications, guidance on that. You're going to do that fine with your annual benefit statements and the portal. And members always have the opportunity to come talk to someone in the benefits department, as I understand, to ask questions. Plan amendments, this is what we were starting with earlier. Again, anytime you want to explore amendments, we would need to price them as the actuary. You need to work with legal counsel to determine if there's any issues in applying an amendment retroactively, prospectively, because there's state laws that talk about requirements for plans, things like that. And so this kind of covers some of those issues that would need to be investigated if there was a plan design study. And then, of course, what we do is we talk to you about the cost of it and what that would mean going forward. Let's see. Again, this is all tied to plan amendments, but it would tie back to those other requirements about what's the design of the plan, what are the goals, what are your workforce initiatives, as we talked about. Pension is an important element of the total compensation. And it's not always just looking at the pension in a vacuum, it's looking at total compensation. And how does it all work together? And is a total compensation package where you want it to be? What are your goals there, and so on?
Quick question. Since these were posed and you did do a high-level risk evaluation, can we, from a high-level perspective, share your findings on what that looks like? Sure.
So going back again, the items evaluated were changing the vesting, extending the vesting schedule from 5 to 10 years, increasing the accrual factor for the first 25 years from 2.5% to 3% in the benefit formula, and then lowering the maximum benefit that only potentially affects a handful of employees. And so, the changes 1 and 3, which are the vesting and the reduction in the maximum, those would decrease the plan liabilities. Because now if it takes longer to get vested, fewer people are gonna vest in their benefit, so the plan liability would be a little lower. Likewise, for the handful of folks who could be affected by the maximum limit, their benefit would be smaller, so it would reduce the liability. But the heavy hitter here is the increase in the formula that affects everybody from 2.5% to 3%, which is a 20% increase in benefits for people who work up to 25 years. Folks who work more than 25 years may end up still with 100% benefit, so it might not have an effect on them when they ultimately retire. And what we determined, and I outlined some of the legal issues I was kind of glossing over, but could you actually apply this retroactively? Are there, certainly you might be able to apply something that enhances benefits retroactively, but could you apply an increase in the vesting schedule retroactively? That would, someone who's 7 years of service right now would go from fully vested to not vested. Likely you couldn't do that. So a lot of times state constitutions or rules will say you have to do it for a new class of employees. You can't touch current employees. So you might go, oh, only for employees hired after January 1, 2025 would they get this new deal. So those are things that would have to be evaluated. And as actuaries, we're not attorneys. We certainly can provide guidance, but we can't tell you what the law says.
And were unrealized potential effects of change in benefit packages talked about? Like, what does it mean for retention? What does it mean for recruitment? What does that mean for how many members we have, and will we have enough to continue to maintain operations? Were those things?
Right. So those are touched upon, right? So this wasn't an official study. This was we'll do a high level review of this, and if you want to pursue the study, then we'll get into those issues. And it never went past the sort of exploratory discussion. But we did do some pricing of, hey, what if it was made retroactive? Because there's some things that are, if you go as retroactive for all service, we can do that pretty quickly on some of these. And so we did, and it would decrease the funded status of the plan by 3% from 71 to 68%. Again, if it was retroactive. It would increase the employer's contribution from 21% of payroll to about 25.5% of payroll, which would be about $2.5 million in 2023 payroll dollars. So that's again, it's not for me to say, but it sounds like a pretty steep increase. It's something for you all to decide if you were to explore this. But we say here, how would these design changes affect employee behavior, for example? Maybe longer vesting encourages people to stick around longer for the short timers. Maybe it encourages people to leave quicker, going, I was gonna get here to 5 years, but you know what? I'm not gonna stay here to 10. So you don't know how it's gonna affect behavior for sure until you put it into practice. Certainly, if you're accruing benefits faster, it might encourage earlier retirement. My benefit's bigger. I don't need to work as long for a bigger benefit. I may leave sooner. What does that do to the workforce? A lot of times, if that's happening at 25 years of service, where the biggest bang for this increase would be, as it's laid out here, potentially as a design change, a lot of times it's the people between age 45 and 55 who that's sort of when they're hitting their best stride or maybe most valuable as a worker to the board potentially. And are they leaving earlier now? Is it encouraging people to leave earlier that you want to leave earlier? Those are the things you have to consider. And of course, you can only guess at how it may affect behavior. You don't know until you implement it what it's really going to do. But certainly, those are things to consider, right? And I think on the benefit, I don't know if it's on this slide, but I think somewhere in my head I have that if the maximum benefit was reduced to $130,000, it might at most affect 6 people in the plan population right now, right? And those 6 people are likely higher paid, and potentially in executive management positions? And do you want to affect the recruiting and retention of those folks, you know? And so those are things to consider. You know, obviously, if you were to pursue something like this, there's nothing saying you have to do 1, 2, and 3. You can do 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. You know, you don't have to do them all, but each one is going to have different effects.
But to be clear, to get to those maximum levels, it's not someone coming in at the executive level. It's someone who would have a career here and has the accrual rate over a long career here in this utility.
That is correct. That you're going to need a long period of service to get to that. Remember, the limit is 275,000 or 100% of pay, and the formula doesn't get to 100% of pay until you've been here 34 years. That said, it's possible at 130,000, someone could hit it at 20 years, you know, instead of 30. But it's not a limit a lot of people are going to hit, period. More people would hit it if it's lowered, but it would still take a long serviced, higher paid individual to hit that limit.
Because right now, like city of New Orleans have over 3,500 employees, and they had placed the limit of $150,000.
Mm-hmm.
Based on, we have only less than 1,200, this formula came up.
I need to look at their plan, but the old limit was 150,000 and it's indexed to inflation. That changed back in 2002, but you didn't have to adopt the new higher limit. But I suspect that 150 may be indexed to inflation, and it might be more like 220 right now.
As far as I know, it's still.
And it may be a flat fixed, but just because the level you said, it is the old limit before the IRS changed it, and it was indexed to inflation. And so I don't know, but if that's what it is, then yeah, it's a different limit. And so these are the issues, like you said, you have to think about workforce recruiting and retention, and how does this positively, negatively, potentially impact those things, on top of the cost considerations of, you know, can we fund a higher benefit level? Is that feasible? So those will be the things that would need to be considered. And here on this slide, we've talked about some of these results under sort of the retroactive application of this, assuming you could apply it retroactively. And it talks about some of the things I just mentioned. And, you know, one thing we recommend is, and it doesn't, I'm not saying this sounds like it has a lot of traction necessarily, but we're going to do this experience study, and it's a good idea sometimes to do a design study relatively close to when an experience study has been completed, because you're going to be guessing at changes in employee behavior. You know, hey, might the termination rates change if we implement a longer vesting schedule? And you want to be doing that based off the most recent experience and assumptions. So we'll do that later in the year, and if there's ever any desire to explore this, you know, that would be a perhaps more appropriate time to explore it. And if we change to doing it every 3 years, the experience study, it'll be perhaps less of an issue because it'll be relatively fresh in any 3-year period. And so again, if I need to wrap up, I'll just wrap it up. But we talked about reciprocity agreements. Some of these best practices apply to OPEB. So, you know, I know the pension committee doesn't address OPEB, but there are things here for folks on the board who may want to become more educated about other post-employment benefits. There's some best practices there. And again, some of the pension ones apply to OPEB plans. Actual experience studies we talked about, and we'll go in more detail on that in July. And the last slide here has links to some best practices, so you can read through this in more detail. And if you have the desire to read more detail, then here's where you can go to read it.
I do have a question.
Question?
I'm sorry, I do have a question. And on some of those suggestions that came from Mr. Mockbull, I didn't really hear you say, don't do this, do this. So when you do your complete report, do you say, this is not a good idea, this is a good idea, or you just lay it all out and let the board make the decision?
So if we did a full plan design study of any design, we would put all the financial ramifications in there, and the gray areas of, well, we don't know how it's going to affect behavior. We can do sensitivity analysis of what if it causes people to work longer, work less. We can do that. So give you all the information, and then we would say, if you were to do it and it has this effect, we would not advise, or not. We would make a statement, and if it's a small change, then we'd say, we don't have an opinion as long as you have the funds to fund this benefit over X years. And so, but yeah, we would give, I'm not giving a firm opinion, this isn't a
Yeah.
firm idea, but I would certainly give one if we did a full study.
Okay, thank you, Mitchell.
Thank you.
And thank the board. It's been a long day, a long morning for everyone. Do we have any public comments? Ed?
No, there are none.
No.
Okay. And just one question I have in regard to changing from 3 to 5 years, that needs to go through a pension committee first with a recommendation to the board?
That is correct.
Okay, okay. There are no public comments. I'll obtain and motion for adjournment.
Before we do that, I wanted to request if we can get Mitchell to give a concrete analysis of these changes, because right now it's read between the lines. What would it take and what is the timeline if the committee decides to let you proceed on that?
So to give you a timeline, we're in the middle of doing the valuations, and we have the portal we're working on and the statements. So I need to get together with my team back at the office to give a timeline. So rather than give something off the cuff, I'd like to discuss it with them first. But I can send Gray an email with here's what the timeline would be. Certainly, we'd need some of these legal issues to be explored before we could do this study. Otherwise, we'd be doing the study under a lot of what ifs. If you can apply it retroactively, it's this. If you can't, it's this.
If we go ahead and drop that retroactive because it's the most contentious proposal, just do the rest of them, and you can get back with Gray and tell them. So we want to rest this one way or another instead of it's been dragging on almost close to 2 years. And they have, almost 600 plus employees who signed for these changes.
I'm sorry, what is the one change you wanted to explore?
No, I'm saying just drop the retroactive.
No, right.
Retroactive, and then do the rest of the proposed changes, studies, and you come up with a concrete proposal saying which will benefit, which would harm, and so the board can make a better decision because none of us, including my own self, can dive deep into, making these changes would have a long-lasting effect or beneficial or detrimental.
Well, I think I'd have to defer to Gray or someone else in here about the procedure for being authorized to do such a study.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to add for the Board of Trustees, we collect information about questions that are raised at any time. We try and provide education on all of the considerations, all of the best practices that GFOA has. We have provided a document to the pension committee about the fact that it's cost prohibitive, not meeting workforce goals. The reason we asked Mitchell to come was to share best practices and education on all of the why questions that have to be addressed and all the alignment that has to exist to even have a consideration of a design change. Thus far, I hear you asking for more information, Moby, but there's no other requests coming for this information. So there's no need to take further action, my opinion, on getting more data for you. We've shared a lot of data, and there's nothing else really.
No, but you got to understand those 600 plus employees who signed and proposed for these changes, they need an answer. It's not just coming from me.
So it sounds to me, personally, as a member of the pension committee, the information we received via memo last month felt sufficient to me to understand the implications of the issue. And so if it pleases the chair of the pension committee, I think we should just put it on the agenda at the next meeting and put it to bed.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
I think you're right. You're right.
Mr. Pace, I have one more question. I don't know if it's gonna be discussed at any time. I did have some retirees reach out to me about the House bill introduced by Representative Hilferty.
Is that something you want to respond to, Gaston?
One
The
specifically.
593 to move to state civil service, they're concerned about what's gonna happen with their pension if we.
To my
Yes.
knowledge, that was done as a placeholder in advance of the task force.
Correct.
If there should be a recommendation related to that, to allow that to happen. I mean, I can only stipulate that it's not likely to happen. I can't guarantee that by any means, but we are not supportive of that. And we made that clear to people who are authoring and trying to advance that.
Yes.
So,
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Then I'll accept the motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you so very much.